The morning sun had barely begun its slow ascent over the Atlanta skyline when Sarah Collins's alarm buzzed sharply at 7:30 a.m. The sound was familiar, predictable, even, but that didn't make it any less jarring. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comments section. Your support will help us bring more meaningful stories like this. She let out a slow breath, rubbed the sleep from her eyes, and reached for her phone to silence the persistent vibration. Years of working as a federal prosecutor had trained her to wake early and start the day with precision. Even on mornings when she had a little extra time, Sarah stuck to her routine. Discipline, preparation, and sharp attention to detail had carried her through law school at Howard and into the prestigious U.S. Attorney's Office, where she had quickly earned a reputation for her relentless work ethic. Her apartment, a sleek but modest high-rise in downtown Atlanta, reflected the same meticulous nature she brought to her work. The small yet carefully curated space was pristine, case files arranged neatly in her home office, books on constitutional law and criminal procedure stacked methodically, and her outfit for the day draped over a chair in her bedroom. Normally she would be heading to the federal courthouse, where she commanded respect in her role as an assistant United States attorney. Today, however, was different. Today she was heading to the municipal court for a minor personal matter, one she had hoped to resolve quickly and without much hassle. A parking ticket. The violation, issued a week earlier, was unjustified. Sarah had been parked legally, but conflicting signage on the street had led to a citation she knew was unwarranted. Ordinarily, she might have paid the fine just to avoid the inconvenience. But this time, she refused. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. If she, a seasoned prosecutor, was expected to accept an unfair penalty without question, how could she expect ordinary citizens to challenge the system when necessary? She dressed with care, but chose a more casual approach than her usual courtroom attire. A navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse and tailored black pants struck the right balance between professional and understated. As she fastened the buttons, she glanced in the mirror, smoothing her hair back into a neatly pinned bun. Recently, she had stopped straightening her hair, embracing her natural curls after years of conforming to professional expectations. At 35, she was confident in who she was, and she wanted the world to see her that way. By 7:15 a.m., she was in her kitchen, slicing a banana into a bowl of yogurt while sipping from a steaming mug of black coffee. Her Mercedes-Benz, an indulgence she had allowed herself after winning a high-profile corruption case, sat parked in the building's garage, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She had noticed on more than one occasion the double-takes from valets or strangers when they saw a young black woman step out of such a high-end car. It never failed to amuse her, though sometimes the assumptions behind those stares stung more than she let on. Traffic in Atlanta was as sluggish as ever, but Sarah had left plenty of time to make her 9 a.m. appearance. She navigated the familiar downtown streets, the morning news playing softly on NPR through her car's speakers. Her mind drifted back to the evidence she had compiled. Photographs of the contradictory parking signs and timestamps proving her innocence. It would be an open and shut case. She would present the facts and the ticket would be dismissed. A rare moment of simplicity in a career often mired in complexity. Then, at 8:15 a.m., her car's Bluetooth system interrupted the news with an incoming call. The name flashing across the dashboard made her pulse quicken. The U.S. Attorney himself. Sarah hit the answer button, keeping her voice steady. "Good morning, sir." "Sarah, sorry for the early call, but we've got a situation with the Thompson trafficking case," her boss said, his voice clipped and urgent. "The defense just filed a last-minute motion, could completely derail the prosecution if we don't respond strategically. I need your eyes on this right away." Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. The Thompson case was one of the largest human trafficking prosecutions in Georgia's history. A case that, if successful, would put several key figures behind bars for life. She couldn't ignore it. "Understood," she said. "What's our deadline?" Jed expects a response by noon. I'm sending the documents now. Can you review them and get back to me ASAP? Sarah exhaled, her mind already switching gears. I'll take a look now and call you shortly. She pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she retrieved her laptop and connected to her phone's hotspot. The defense's motion was intricate, laced with legal maneuvers meant to weaken their case. She scanned the document, taking quick but detailed notes. Minutes slipped by unnoticed as she worked. When she finally glanced at the time, a bolt of panic shot through her. 8:50 a.m. The municipal court was still 10 minutes away, and she hadn't accounted for parking. She hurriedly called her boss back, delivered a concise analysis, and promised a more detailed follow-up after her court appearance. Then, with a deep breath, she pulled back onto the road, urging herself to remain calm. By the time she reached the municipal court's parking lot, it was 9:10 a.m. Sarah hated being late. It went against every fiber of her being. But today, circumstances had left her little choice. She gathered her paperwork and strode toward the courthouse, her heels clicking against the pavement. As she reached the entrance, her phone buzzed with a message from her boss. "Great work. Your insight just gave us the leverage we needed." Sarah allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The morning may have started with an unexpected detour, but at least it had been worth it. What she didn't know, as she stepped into Judge William Barrett's courtroom, was that this seemingly minor delay would set off a series of events that would shake the very foundation of the justice system she had sworn to uphold. Judge Barrett had a reputation for order and efficiency. At 62, his graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses lent him an air of unwavering authority, built over 3 decades on the bench. He prided himself on punctuality, and expected the same from those who entered his courtroom. This morning, as he surveyed the gathered attendees, he noted with approval the early arrivals. Mostly white professionals, dressed in business attire, their paperwork neatly arranged. He glanced at the clock. 9:11 a.m. And then, just as he was about to begin, the courtroom doors opened, and Sarah Collins stepped inside. The next moments would reveal truths about the justice system she had long suspected but had never confronted so personally. Today was supposed to be routine. It would be anything but. The steady murmur of voices in the courtroom quieted as the large clock on the wall struck precisely at 9 a.m. The bailiff, standing tall in his crisp uniform, cleared his throat and called out, "All rise." A rustle of movement followed as everyone in the courtroom stood in unison. Judge Barrett entered from his chambers with his usual air of authority, his black robe billowing slightly as he took his seat. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the courtroom with sharp eyes, and immediately began his daily proceedings. Judge Barrett had spent years cultivating an efficient and disciplined courtroom. To him, punctuality was not just a rule, but a reflection of one's respect for the judicial system. Every morning he called cases in swift succession, his tone firm. Delays were intolerable. Tardiness, in his view, was more than an inconvenience, it was an affront to the integrity of the court itself. He expected perfection in procedure, and he brooked no exceptions. At precisely 9:15 a.m., the heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The intrusion was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it was enough to make Judge Barrett pause mid-sentence. The room, already hushed, seemed to fall into an even deeper silence as all eyes turned to the latecomer. Sarah Collins, dressed in a navy blue suit, stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor as she moved with deliberate care toward the seating area. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, trying not to disrupt the ongoing case, but it was too late. Judge Barrett's gaze locked onto her immediately, his expression darkening. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The room tensed. The case in progress was forgotten in an instant. The defendant left hanging mid-explanation as the judge's full attention shifted to Sarah. His piercing eyes bore into her, analyzing every detail. The courtroom, once filled with the sounds of proceedings, now buzzed with an unspoken tension. It was as if an invisible spotlight had been cast over Sarah, illuminating her presence in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Sarah moved toward the podium with calm, measured steps, her posture straight, her hands folded in front of her. She was used to scrutiny. She had faced tougher situations in her career, but something about this moment felt different, more insidious. Judge Barrett picked up his schedule and scanned it with deliberate slowness. "You must be Sarah Collins, scheduled for 9 a.m., he stated, his tone heavy with disapproval. He emphasized the time as if to drive a nail into a board. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than the court's time, Miss Collins?" Before Sarah could open her mouth to respond, he continued, his voice growing louder, intended not just for her but for the entire courtroom. "This court has procedures. This is not some informal gathering where you can arrive at your leisure. This is a place of law and order. We do not tolerate tardiness." Sarah remained composed, her breathing steady, but she couldn't ignore the way his words dripped with condescension. She had been here before, though the circumstances were different. The way he spoke to her, not as a professional, but as someone who needed a lesson, was all too familiar. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the audience. There, near the front, sat a white businessman who had arrived late as well, just minutes before her. The judge hadn't said a word to him. A young white woman who had slipped in at 9:10 a.m., sat quietly without a single reprimand. The pattern was painfully clear. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood at his post near the judge's bench. An older black man with years of experience in the courtroom, he had seen this scenario play out more times than he cared to count. His gaze met Sarah's for the briefest moment, and in that glance there was an unspoken understanding. He gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, but it was enough to let her know that she was not imagining this. She was not alone in noticing the disparity. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Sarah began, her voice level and unwavering. "You may not," Judge Barrett cut her off before she could continue. "I've heard every excuse before. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergency. None of it matters here. The rules are clear, and they apply to everyone." His words rang hollow. Sarah knew they didn't apply to everyone, not equally. The gavel in his hand hovered above his desk, his fingers gripping it tightly, as if the very act of holding it reinforced his power. The weight of the room pressed down on her, but she remained firm. "This court will not tolerate such blatant disregard for procedure," Judge Barrett declared, his face tinged with the slightest shade of red, a sign of his growing irritation. "Perhaps a fine will serve as a reminder of the importance of punctuality." The tension in the room thickened. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman with years of experience working alongside the judge, kept her head down as she typed. Even she seemed ill at ease with what was unfolding. "Miss Collins," Judge Barrett announced, his voice echoing through the grand courtroom, "this court hereby fines you $500 for contempt. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 1 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." A murmur swept through the room. The amount was unusually steep. It was one of the highest fines he had imposed for tardiness in recent memory. But Judge Barrett did not acknowledge this fact. He merely let the number settle, watching her reaction with detached authority. Sarah remained still, her mind cataloging every second of this moment. She had faced discrimination before, but this was more than personal bias. This was power wielded unfairly, a system bending under the weight of prejudice while pretending to stand tall in the name of justice. What Judge Barrett did not realize as he prepared to move on to the next case was that his decision at that moment would set in motion a ripple effect far beyond what he anticipated. He believed he was closing a matter, reinforcing the order of his court, but in reality he was opening a door, one that would lead to a reckoning far greater than he could have imagined. the real shock of the morning was still to come. The court clerk, Mrs. Evelyn Thompson, hesitated as she typed the fine into the computer system, her normally steady fingers faltering slightly on the keyboard. For 12 years she had meticulously recorded the proceedings of this courtroom, transcribing the spoken word into official records without question. Yet something about this particular moment unsettled her enough to warrant a discreet note in her log. Just last week, a white male attorney had arrived 20 minutes late, not explaining whatsoever, and had received only a mild verbal warning dismissed with a casual wave of the hand. But today, the atmosphere was different, charged with an unspoken tension that everyone seemed to recognize, but no one dared to acknowledge outright. Further, Judge Barrett continued, his voice carrying the weight of practiced authority, let this serve as a lesson in responsibility. He lifted a sheet of paper from the bench, pretending to consult its contents, though it was clearly for show. The justice system functions on order and respect. Without punctuality, we have chaos. In the gallery, the other defendants watched the scene unfold, their reactions varying from discomfort to barely concealed disdain. A young white woman in a sharp business suit discreetly checked her watch, recalling with no small amount of unease that she, too, had arrived late that morning. Unlike the defendant standing before the judge now, she had received no reprimand, no lecture on professionalism, and certainly no financial penalty. An elderly black man in the back row shook his head slightly, his expression resigned but unsurprised. He had seen this play out too many times before. This wasn't about tardiness, and everyone in the room knew it. Standing stoically by the judge's bench, the bailiff, James Wilson, maintained his usual professional stance, his expression neutral. But to those who knew him well, the slight tightening of his jaw was unmistakable. He had served in this courthouse for 15 years, long enough to recognize patterns, long enough to keep a mental ledger of the disparities he witnessed. Today's fine was steeper than usual, and the justification behind it rang hollow. The weight of the moment pressed against him, but, like always, he remained silent. At the podium, Sarah Collins took a slow, deliberate breath. She had spent years in federal courtrooms, prosecuting high-stakes cases, standing toe-to-toe with seasoned defense attorneys, and securing convictions against some of the most dangerous criminals. But today was different. Today was personal. And yet, it wasn't just about her. It was about something larger, something systemic. Without breaking her professional composure, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, subtly noting the time and the precise amount of the fine in a document labeled simply, Court, Observation. Additionally, Judge Barrett added, his tone growing even more self-assured, you'll pay this fine before leaving the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you to be late with that as well. A few forced chuckles rippled through the gallery, but they quickly dissipated into an uneasy silence. The weight of the moment pressed against the walls of the courtroom, making the already stale air feel even heavier. The morning sunlight, shifting through the tall windows, cast a golden glow on Sarah's face as she stood beneath the judge's gaze. Though her posture remained poised, her eyes held a steely determination that a wiser judge might have taken as a warning. She had spent years meticulously gathering evidence, uncovering corruption, and building cases that shattered careers. And now Judge Barrett was unwittingly providing her with every element she needed to expose the very bias he so brazenly displayed. "Do you understand the fine as I have explained it?" Judge Barrett asked, his tone tinged with the expectation of meek acceptance. Sarah lifted her chin slightly, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear, controlled, and devoid of any emotional tremor. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely." Each syllable was deliberate, every word measured. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was not outrage, not argument, but quiet documentation. A waiting game. Satisfied with what he interpreted as submission, Judge Garrett nodded curtly, his attention already shifting to the next case file on his desk. He was prepared to move on, convinced that this moment, This exercise of authority was finished. What he failed to notice, however, was the way Sarah's fingers moved swiftly over her phone's screen, documenting every word, every inflection, every disparity. He was entirely unaware that his supposed assertion of control had just become evidence in a much larger conversation about justice and equality within his courtroom. The room remained tense as he prepared to call the next case, but Sarah wasn't finished. She was just getting started. The moment she unlatched her briefcase, the very air in the courtroom seemed to shift. From within its leather depths, she retrieved a black credential holder, its gold federal seal gleaming under the sunlight. Judge Barrett, already moving on, barely registered the movement. Until Sarah spoke again. "Your Honor," she said, and this time her voice carried a new authority, one that could not be ignored. "Before we proceed, I need to formally introduce myself for the record." She held up her credentials, the unmistakable badge of the United States Department of Justice reflecting the light. The effect was immediate. The gallery, the bailiff, the clerk, all froze in collective realization. Judge Barrett's face, which had been flushed with the confidence of unchecked authority mere moments before, drained of color. His hand, poised to turn the next page in his docket, hovered motionless in the air. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the faint rhythmic hum of the aging ceiling fan above seemed deafening in contrast. Mrs. Thompson, hands still poised over her keyboard, had stopped typing mid-sentence. The bailiff, James Wilson, allowed himself the smallest of smirks, just enough to betray his satisfaction. He had seen a great many things in this courtroom, but this was a moment he would remember for years to come. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, opening his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time that morning he looked at Sarah. Looked at her. He saw not just a woman standing before him, not just a black woman in a courtroom that so often seemed designed to work against her, but a federal prosecutor, a force to be reckoned with. Sarah, ever composed, continued as though she hadn't just shattered the balance of power in the room. "I apologize for my tardiness this morning, Your Honor," she said, her tone calm yet unyielding. "I was delayed due to an urgent federal case requiring immediate detention, the Thompson human trafficking prosecution, which I believe you're familiar with from the news." A pause. Waited. Intentional. "I have written confirmation of this from the U.S. Attorney's Office, which I'm happy to provide to the court." Across the gallery, the young white woman who had arrived late without consequence sank lower in her seat, the reality of what she had just witnessed setting in. The elderly black man nodded, a glimmer of approval in his tired eyes. "And Judge Barrett?" For the first time in his long career, he found himself at a loss for words. The elderly black man seated in the gallery straightened his posture, a glimmer of pride flickering across his weathered face. This was a moment he had spent decades yearning for, a moment he had doubted he would ever witness within these walls. His hands, rough with age and experience, gripped the polished wooden bench as he leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single word of what was about to unfold. Judge Barrett, an experienced but visibly flustered municipal court judge, sat behind his elevated bench, his authority momentarily shaken. His mouth opened and closed several times as though searching for the right words, his fingers twitching over the stack of papers before him. He cleared his throat, buying himself time. Attorney Collins, He hesitated, shuffling through his documents, his normally commanding presence diminished. "Had I known your position—" "My position," Sarah Collins interrupted, her voice calm yet unwavering, "should not be relevant, Your Honor. What matters is the fair and equal application of justice." She reached into her sleek leather bag, retrieving her credentials, and placed them deliberately on the podium. Then, with the same measured precision, she pulled out her phone, its screen aglow with the evidence she had been meticulously documenting throughout the morning's proceedings. "I have recorded several troubling patterns in today's court session," including the unequal treatment of defendants based on race and perceived social standing," she stated, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge's face, initially pale, now bore a tinge of green. As a municipal judge, he was well aware of how swiftly a federal prosecutor's scrutiny could dismantle a career. His mind raced backward, replaying the morning's cases through a different lens, seeing the disparities that had gone unnoticed, or worse, unchecked, under his watch. "Perhaps," he said quickly, attempting to regain control, "we could discuss this matter in chambers, and of course, the fine is dismissed." "No, Your Honor," Sarah countered, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. It was the weight of every prejudiced remark, every dismissive glance, every moment she had fought to be recognized as an equal. "The fine should not be dismissed merely because of my position. Doing so would only reinforce the very systemic bias I am calling attention to. Instead, I believe this presents an opportunity for a much-needed discussion about equal treatment under the law." The other defendants, many of whom had resigned themselves to the status quo, now sat on the edge of their seats. Some clutched their paperwork, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and vindication. A few had their phones in hand, despite court regulations prohibiting recordings, determined to capture a moment that they knew would become part of their personal histories. Mrs. Thompson, the seasoned court stenographer, found her fingers racing across the keyboard with newfound urgency. She had seen Judge Barrett's scoldings countless times over the years and had heard the harsh tone reserved for certain defendants, while others were granted leniency. But never before had she seen him so directly and skillfully confronted. The morning sunlight now streamed fully through the large courthouse windows, casting long golden beams that illuminated the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Judge Barrett sat rigidly in his high-backed chair, his authority visibly fraying. Meanwhile, Sarah Collins stood tall at the podium, no longer just a defendant but an advocate, a catalyst for change, the embodiment of the justice the court was meant to uphold. The weight of the moment settled over the room as realization dawned on everyone present. What had begun as a routine hearing over a parking violation had transformed into something far more significant. This was not just a dispute over a fine. It was a reckoning, a challenge to the entrenched biases within the justice system, one that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Judge Barrett cleared his throat once more, his discomfort now unmistakable. "Attorney Collins," he said, his tone significantly softer than before, "please allow me to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred." He pressed a button on his desk, summoning his clerk. "We will have this fine removed from the record immediately." Sarah did not move. Her expression did not waver. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady yet unyielding, "I must decline." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her fingers momentarily frozen above the keyboard. The bailiff, James Wilson, subtly adjusted his stance, sensing that history was in the making. "Instead of dismissing the fine," Sarah continued, holding up her phone, "I would like to address the larger issue at hand." She turned slightly, meeting the eyes of those seated behind her before directing her gaze back to the judge. "This morning I documented 7 individuals who entered this courtroom after the 9 a.m. start time. 3 were white professionals who received no reprimand whatsoever. 2 were Asian students who were given verbal warnings, and 2 were black individuals, myself included, who received the harshest treatment. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 2 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." Silence blanketed the room as the weight of her words sank in. Judge Barrett's face reddened, not with anger, but with the unmistakable sting of embarrassment. This moment would not be brushed aside. It would not be forgotten. It was the beginning of a conversation that the courtroom and the system it represented could no longer avoid. "Now, Ms. Attorney Collins," "These are very serious allegations you're making." Judge Barrett's voice wavered slightly, his usual judicial confidence appearing somewhat shaken. His fingers gripped the edges of his bench, as if steadying himself. "I assure you that this court treats everyone equally." "The evidence suggests otherwise, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her tone unwavering. She turned slightly, addressing the entire courtroom as she spoke. "I have already compiled a detailed report and sent it to my office. As an officer of the federal court, I must document and report any patterns of discriminatory behavior in our justice system." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the sound of Mrs. Thompson's steady typing seemed to slow as the weight of Sarah's words settled over the room. In the back row, a young law student furiously scribbled notes, his heart pounding. This was the kind of legal drama that no textbook could capture. Just a few seats away, an elderly black man dabbed at his eyes with a folded handkerchief, the scene before him a painful reminder of his encounters with injustice over the decades. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "What exactly are you proposing?" His voice lacked the authority it had carried at the start of the hearing. The morning sun streaming through the courtroom windows now felt glaring, like an interrogation lamp trained on his face. Sarah stepped forward, placing both hands firmly on the podium, her presence commanding attention. "I propose 3 immediate actions, Your Honor." She held up one finger. "First, I will pay the $500 fine. Not because it is just, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings." She raised a second finger. "Second, I request that Your Honor review the last 6 months of contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom with a focus on demographic patterns." The judge's complexion visibly paled. "And third, I strongly suggest mandatory bias training for all court personnel, including the bench." The courtroom remained still, though the tension was palpable. The stenographer continued her transcription, her fingers moving with newfound urgency. The bailiff, a seasoned officer who had stood witness to countless hearings, offered a barely perceptible nod, an acknowledgment that Sarah was speaking a truth too often left unspoken. Judge Barrett inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening as he searched for a response. "These suggestions," he began, struggling to maintain control of the room, "while well-intentioned, seem rather extreme for a simple matter of tardiness." Sarah's gaze remained steady. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied, "what is extreme is the ongoing pattern of racial bias in our courts. As a federal prosecutor, I have seen firsthand how these so-called simple matters accumulate over time, creating systemic barriers to justice. This isn't about one fine. It's about an entire system that disproportionately punishes individuals based on race." She reached into her briefcase and retrieved her checkbook. "I'll pay the fine now," she said, her voice devoid of anger or resentment, just calm, professional resolve. "And my office will be in touch regarding the review of court records." The sunlight had shifted higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the polished wood of the courtroom. Though Judge Barrett still occupied his elevated chair, he no longer seemed to tower over the room. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone present could feel it. This was no longer just a heated courtroom exchange. It was the beginning of something bigger. By late afternoon, news of the confrontation had spread like wildfire through Atlanta's legal community. The first ripple came from the young law student who had witnessed everything. He sent a text to his study group. "Just saw something incredible in municipal court. Federal prosecutor exposed judge's racial bias. You won't believe what happened." From there, the story took on a life of its own. Black attorneys from across the city began calling Sarah, eager to share their own experiences in Judge Barrett's courtroom. Many had remained silent for years, fearing professional repercussions. Now, with Sarah's bold stand, they saw an opportunity to speak. Marcus Johnson, a colleague and fellow federal prosecutor, knocked on Sarah's office door that evening. "Your phone's been buzzing all afternoon," he said, gesturing to her desk. "Looks like you struck a nerve." Sarah exhaled slowly, glancing at the growing list of messages. "This isn't just about me," she said. "For every attorney who's faced this kind of treatment, imagine how many regular citizens suffer in silence." Meanwhile, in the courthouse break room, Mrs. Thompson, the veteran court clerk, hesitated before pulling a small, leather-bound notebook from her desk drawer. "I've been keeping my records," she admitted to a small group of colleagues. "Every time I saw something that didn't seem right, unfair rulings, disproportionate fines, I wrote it down. Dates, names, everything." Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through pages filled with meticulous notes spanning years. The other clerks exchanged glances. They had all seen it happen, but Mrs. Thompson had proof. By early evening, local news stations had caught wind of the story. Outside the courthouse, a Channel 5 news crew hurried to set up their camera equipment. Michael Chen, a sharp-eyed investigative reporter, adjusted his tie as he prepared to go live. Sources inside the courthouse confirm that a federal prosecutor was fined $500 this morning for being late to court, he reported, staring into the camera. But what happened next has ignited a citywide conversation about bias in our justice system. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media. The hashtags Judge Barrett and Justice is Colorblind began trending in Atlanta. Former defendants came forward posting about their own experiences in Barrett's courtroom. Story after story surfaced, painting a picture that was impossible to ignore. A pattern of harsher sentences, excessive fines, and dismissive treatment, always against people of color. By the time Sarah left her office that night, she knew the wheels had been set in motion. This wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was the start of something much bigger, and she was ready for whatever came next. Judge Barrett sat in his home that evening, his usually composed demeanor overshadowed by an unshakable sense of unease. The glow of the television screen flickered across the room, illuminating the deep lines of concern on his face as he watched the news coverage unfold. His phone had been ringing relentlessly since early afternoon. Calls from colleagues, members of the Judicial Review Board, and a seemingly endless stream of reporters eager for a statement. He had dedicated 3 decades of his life to the judiciary, yet now his entire career was under an intense microscope. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah's office phone rang yet again. She hesitated before answering, recognizing the exhaustion creeping into her voice. This time it was Sharon Martinez, a well-respected civil rights attorney known for her tireless work in exposing systemic bias within the legal system. "We've been tracking these patterns for years," Sharon explained, her voice measured yet urgent. "But coming from a federal prosecutor, especially one who's experienced it firsthand, this changes everything. The public is paying attention, and we have an opportunity here. Would you be willing to speak at a press conference tomorrow?" As the evening wore on, the municipal court's filing office buzzed with quiet activity. Clerks sifted through stacks of records, their eyes widening as they began noticing the troubling patterns buried within Judge Barrett's rulings. One clerk, flipping through a recent batch of sentencing data, gasped audibly. Over the past year alone, black defendants had been 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines in his courtroom compared to their white counterparts facing identical charges. The whispers among the staff grew into hushed conversations, and by nightfall the story had taken on a life of its own. National media outlets picked up the reports, with headlines ranging from "Atlanta Judge Faces Scrutiny After Finding Federal Prosecutor" to "Racial Bias in Georgia Courtroom Exposed." Social media ignited, flooded with discussions about systemic racism in the judiciary. Sarah's experience became a rallying point, a stark illustration of the inequities that had long existed beneath the surface but were now impossible to ignore. James Wilson, the courtroom bailiff, had his phone ringing incessantly. Fellow court officers reached out, their voices laced with a mix of surprise and vindication. We all saw things, James admitted in one conversation. But this time, someone with power saw it too, and she refused to let it slide. He thought back to the countless times he had witnessed similar incidents, his hands tied by the system's rigid hierarchy. Now, for the first time, there was a real chance for accountability. Late into the night, Sarah sat in her home office, scrolling through the hundreds of messages that had flooded her inbox. Legal organizations extended invitations for her to speak at conferences. Civil rights groups sought her assistance in documenting other cases of judicial misconduct. Law schools requested her to guest lecture on the importance of standing up against systemic bias. She exhaled deeply and opened her laptop. Without hesitation, she began drafting a formal complaint to the Judicial Qualifications Commission. This wasn't just about Judge Barrett anymore. It had grown into something much bigger. A movement. A demand for reform in a system that had operated unchecked for far too long. Her phone buzzed one last time before she turned in for the night. A message from a young black law student appeared on the screen. "Thank you for showing us that we can fight the system from within. You've given us hope." A week after the incident, the State Judicial Qualifications Commission announced a formal investigation into Judge Barrett's conduct. In the expansive conference room on the 10th floor of the State Justice Building, a team of investigators pored over thousands of court records spanning the past 5 years. Linda Martinez, the lead investigator with 2 decades of experience, spread dozens of case files across the long wooden table. "Look at these numbers," she said, pointing to a meticulously organized spreadsheet on her laptop. In traffic violation cases, black defendants paid an average fine of $500, while white defendants paid $150 for the same offenses. She adjusted her glasses, her voice firm. And that's just the beginning. Down the hall, in a small interview room, Mrs. Thompson, Judge Barrett's former clerk, sat nervously with a worn notebook in front of her. She had spent 12 years documenting every questionable ruling, every biased comment, every instance where she had felt powerless to speak out. Now she finally had a platform to be heard. "I noticed the pattern my first year," she confessed, her voice shaking slightly. The way he spoke to people, he was different. His tone, his patience, and the time he allowed them to explain their cases. It all depended on what they looked like. As the investigation deepened, the revelations became even more disturbing. Black women, on average, received the highest fines. Cases involving minority defendants were processed 40% faster, often leading to rushed verdicts. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more frequently for people of color. Character witnesses for minority defendants were interrupted or dismissed at disproportionately high rates. Judge Barrett himself was called in for multiple rounds of questioning. Each session peeled back another layer of unconscious bias. When presented with the data, his face paled. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he murmured, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "I never thought... I didn't realize." For the first time, he seemed to comprehend the weight of his actions. Yet the investigation did not stop with him. As the review board expanded its scope, it uncovered similar patterns in rulings from several other judges within the district. What began as an inquiry into a single judge had unraveled a systemic issue far more pervasive than anyone had anticipated. By the end of the 3rd week, Linda Martinez and her team had compiled a comprehensive report, a 300-page document filled with statistics, testimonies, and in-depth analyses of thousands of cases. The evidence was undeniable, and change was no longer a distant possibility. It was imminent. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 3 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Linda took a deep breath and steadied herself before addressing the commission board. The weight of the thick report in her hands was nothing compared to the gravity of its contents. She placed it deliberately on the long, polished table, and let her gaze sweep across the room, making eye contact with each commissioner. "This report doesn't just highlight a handful of unfortunate incidents," she began, her voice steady but charged with urgency. "It lays bare a deeply entrenched systemic bias that has shaped legal outcomes for thousands of people over many years." She let the words hang in the air before continuing. "And perhaps even more troubling is the way this bias has operated so subtly, so insidiously, that many of those who perpetuate it don't even realize they are doing so." A heavy silence filled the room. The commissioners shifted in their seats. Some glanced at the thick stack of papers before them, as if seeing its true weight for the first time. The investigation had begun as a single case, a single moment of injustice that might have been ignored like so many before it. But Sarah Collins's experience had become more than just another story lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. It had been the spark that set off an avalanche. One instance of mistreatment had led to another, and another, until a pattern had become undeniable. The walls that had shielded decades of unfairness and quiet discrimination were beginning to crack. At the heart of the investigation was Judge Barrett, a man who had long wielded the gavel with impunity. But as the commission sifted through case files, courtroom transcripts, and testimony from countless individuals who had stood before him, it became evident that this was never just about one judge. It was about a legal system that had allowed unchecked bias to fester, masquerading as impartiality. The question before the commission was no longer whether to hold Judge Barrett accountable. That was inevitable. The real question was how to ensure that systemic reform followed, that change was not merely symbolic but deeply structural. 3 months after Sarah Collins had walked into Judge Barrett's courtroom and refused to stay silent, the landscape of justice in Atlanta had already begun to shift. In the crisp morning air, sunlight streamed through the towering windows of the city courthouse as workers affixed a new sign above the entrance: Center for Judicial Education and Equality Training. Judge Barrett was no longer seated behind the bench. After the investigation exposed his years of unchecked bias, he had been given a choice: resign or face public hearings that would scrutinize every decision he had ever made. He chose resignation. But his departure was not the end of his story. In an unexpected turn, Judge Barrett had opted to take part in the solution. Standing before a room filled with judges, lawyers, and court staff, he took a deep breath before addressing them. "I never recognized my own bias," he admitted, his voice softer than it had been in his years of rulings. "I thought fairness meant treating everyone the same. What I failed to see was how my background, my assumptions, shaped every decision I made." His posture, once rigid with authority, now carried a quiet humility. Sarah Collins sat in the back of the training room, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't expected this outcome when she first took a stand in that courtroom 3 months ago. Next to her, Mrs. Thompson, a former court clerk, listened intently. She had since been promoted to lead a newly established court monitoring program, designed to prevent the very injustices she had once felt powerless against. But the changes reached far beyond one courthouse. A city-wide overhaul had been set in motion. Courts were now required to maintain and publicly share detailed records of sentencing, fines, and judicial conduct. These records were reviewed monthly by an independent oversight committee composed of legal experts, civil rights advocates, and community representatives. James Wilson, a longtime bailiff, had stepped into a new role, leading a training program for courtroom staff. "We are the eyes and ears of the courtroom," he told his first group of trainees. "For too long we've stayed silent when we saw unfair treatment. Those days are over. If we see something wrong, we say something." At her desk in the federal prosecutor's office, Sarah glanced up at the wall where she had framed the $500 fine receipt that had set everything in motion. It was no longer just a reminder of the injustice she had faced. It was a symbol of the change that had followed. Beneath it hung a new photograph. Sarah standing with a group of law students. She now taught a weekly course on ethics and bias in the legal system, helping future lawyers recognize and challenge discrimination within the courts. The reform spread beyond Atlanta. Other cities took notice and began implementing similar measures. Mandatory bias training for judges and legal personnel, independent reviews of sentencing disparities, the formation of community oversight boards, and stricter guidelines to ensure that fines and punishments were administered equitably. Law schools introduced new curricula that emphasized racial and socioeconomic bias in the justice system, ensuring that future generations of legal professionals would be equipped to recognize and challenge discrimination in its many forms. One morning, 3 months to the day since her fateful court appearance, Sarah received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter from a young law student who had been in the courtroom that day. The student wrote about how the experience had altered the course of her career. She had since chosen to pursue civil rights law, dedicating herself to defending those who faced unjust treatment in the legal system. "You showed me that change is possible," the letter read. "That sometimes all it takes is one person standing up and saying, 'This isn't right.'" The student had even founded a legal clinic at her law school, providing free representation to individuals facing discrimination in court. Across town, an elderly black man walked slowly through the courthouse halls, taking in the transformation. The signs were now printed in multiple languages, ensuring accessibility for all visitors. A newly established help desk offered free legal assistance to those who needed it. Security guards, once impersonal and indifferent, greeted everyone who entered with a smile. The system had not been fixed overnight. There was still much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, justice in Atlanta was moving in the right direction. Now let's take a step back and reflect. What have you learned from this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone was unfairly treated because of bias? How would you handle it? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and share one key takeaway from this story. Something that resonated with you and that you'll bring into your own life moving forward. Whether it's standing up for what's right, recognizing unconscious bias, or simply being more aware of fairness in everyday situations. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more thought-provoking stories like this one to light. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.